Hi, I'm Ruth Johnston. I'd like to tell you about how my book, Remodeling the Mind, Personality and Balance, could be very helpful in your homeschool. First of all, we homeschoolers know that when you stop going to school in a classroom and you start having all of your learning at home, individuals matter a lot more. When you're in a classroom, if the book isn't really working for you, nobody cares that much because it might be working for someone else and they go by averages. If you have a personality clash with your teacher, maybe you have other teachers for other subjects, or next year you'll have a different teacher. None of that really matters. It's all aimed at the group average. Homeschool, completely the opposite. Who the child is as a student and who the parent is as a teacher become the key factors in whether the homeschool is going to be successful or not. And sometimes that works great, other times it doesn't. Sometimes one child in the family works great and another child not at all. And it can be really frustrating when you're that parent and you're trying to get everything right, but the student is just not happy. And since it's not just a student, it's your child, it matters a lot. When people look at personality type, they often think that we're going to be doing this. I'm going to say, I found a box of pigeonholes. I'm going to put a couple of postcards in one of them, but I'm going to put you in another. Here's you. You're not so sure about this. And I'm going to say, oh, I'm over here. I'm in this pigeonhole, and I'm really happy about it because I feel like this is great. You know, me and George Washington are in it together. So I'm going to tell you what box you fit into. And when you say, oh, I don't know, really, I think this is what you think of yourself as. This is you. Really, I think that maybe part of that box is right, but, you know, I've got this other thing. And then there's another couple things that are really shaped differently. I think this is me. And I'll say, nope, 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 nope. You're in a box. Good enough. And you're going to say, this is not useful. That's not what I do with this. I don't know, maybe that's not what other people do either. But it feels like that sometimes to people. Instead, with the way I have it laid out, we look at processes of thinking as laid out by Carl Jung, judging and perceiving, basic processes of thinking that everybody has and that you may have in a similar pattern to many other people. And the types of judging and perceiving, feeling and thinking, sensing and intuition, that follow certain patterns, and you may have those in common. So, for example, when you're thinking about the child, the student in your homeschool, you may realize that you and the student have similar thinking patterns, but you have very different sensing patterns or intuition patterns. And that could be why you look at a book and say, this will be great. Your student looks at it and gets very upset, and things like that. And so without looking at pigeonholes, we begin to see some of the similarities and differences in how people think. Another objection that people often have to personality type is that science has not caught up with this idea yet. And that's true. Neuroscience is not there. When neuroscience looks at personality, they're only looking at the large outlines of things. Like they're working on proving that in the animal kingdom, as well as among human beings, there are such things as, introverted or shy animals or things like that. They're trying to prove that some things are inborn. And really, when you talk about personality type, you're taking that as a given and you're trying to move beyond that. And you're moving well beyond where science can take you. But there are some things you can do about that. One of the things that I do here is I look a lot at systems that we see in nature, patterns, ways that systems in nature function, and the way animals learn. So, for example, here on this page, we're talking about sparrows learning to chirp. On this page, I guess this is all about the sparrows. And then discussing how that applies to babies learning. Looking at inborn templates for safety and danger, things that we understand that animals know. We say they know that by instinct. But human beings have some things like that too. So what kinds of things would babies have by instinct? Here's, for example, a little experiment having to do with Kangaroo Island with an inbred population of wallabies and which animals they were afraid of as predators, even if they'd never seen them. Well, what can we learn about babies from things like that and from studies of babies? What are babies automatically afraid of? I look at some studies of babies, the way they look at faces, the way they learn from faces. Some studies that suggest that babies have a natural sense that snakes and spiders are trouble and need to be kept an eye on. How babies learn about things. And so by trying to seat the discussion of personality on top of those roots, I try to keep it as close to science as possible. And when we get to the point where we're leaving the gates of science, I say that clearly. From this point on, we're just looking at speculation. Because of this approach, I end up defining introverted and extroverted in a very different way. So you can see on this page, introverted refers to the part of the mind that is focused on the inborn template. The very basics that we often use as terminology with personality here are actually rooted in what's inborn and what's learned, and some of the really fundamental things like that of how we're put together. So I use some words in some different ways, and I have a really different approach. The majority of the book is looking at the different parts and processes of personality. For example, thinking. So for thinking, there's chapter 4, thinking. With thinking, we talk about extroverted thinking. And then, for example, after I explain it, I have some literary examples. We find what I think is extroverted thinking in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, when he's talking about listening to a great preacher. In René Descartes saying, coming up to his famous conclusion, I think, therefore I am, in the reasoning leading up to that, he's explaining how he uses logic. Another example given here is a passage from the first Sherlock Holmes story, where he's explaining why a test will help very much with the logic of something. And then I shift over to a different pattern of thinking, one that's rooted in what I would consider an inborn template of danger and safety. And again, after describing it, go through literary examples from Jane Austen, from an Egyptian book of Proverbs, from the novel Middlemarch, and from the novel Rob Roy in this set. Every chapter is laid out like that. We come over to thinking, and there are 2 different patterns discussed and literary examples given. And so the first part goes through all of those parts. The next part talks about balancing them. What I'm really interested in with this is that the parts seem to interact in a way in a system. And I use the example of a mobile, which is why the cover shows a mobile. These stand for thinking and feeling and sensing and intuition. So here I have a mobile, and I'm discussing how the different patterns can be fitted together according to some rules that Jung had observed, and describing them really as types of patterns. Here you see generating more patterns. So by the time you get to something that looks like pigeonholes, you've actually found out why each one is a type of pattern that fits together and all of the different ways it fits. Of course, I have the personality profiles, and you'll see some of them are similar. You may have seen them in other books, but I'm presenting them here with a set of cartoons showing the different functions and the way they're arranged, and here with the mobile showing them balanced. So again, it's a little bit different. Partway through the book, we get to chapter 4, or part 4, relationships and balance. And here we're looking at how the different individuals in their types may interact with each other. There are discussions of parents and children, people at school, marriages, friendships, And it's discussed in a way that we found pretty useful, where there are clear columns of personality types that are similar. And then in the next chapter, I present rows of personality types that I think are also similar. And here I have pictures. So what I would call a top level of dominance is someone who sees himself as naturally in charge of, as far as he can see, the tops of the hills. Another one where he feels that he should have the say in what goes on in a bounded area that may include other people. And after defining these, put them together in a chart that begins to look at them together. And then we discuss, how do they fit together? And you can find a lot of the answers to why you maybe don't get along in your homeschool in things like this. You could have a parent who has a very narrow, low dominance, and a child with a very high, broad dominance. And the child still has to listen to the parent. But there's just going to be some natural tendency to feel like he already knows things. You can combat that with a frontal assault and just say, go to your room. Or using some of these things, you can find ways to say, all right, here's the way I see it. Here's the way you probably see it. Let's come up with a learning approach that'll work for you. The last chapter discusses marriage imbalance, and it just makes some observations about very typical ways that people struggle to get along, and looks ahead, especially for young people who right now aren't attached to anyone. When you look ahead, if you want to make a wise choice for life, what are you going to look at? How do you know that the person who's a certain way at 15 is going to be a certain way at 50? And so that's what this chapter discusses and addresses. All in all, none of it's exactly about your textbooks, but all of it's about choosing the right textbooks, choosing the right directions. It's a thoughtful book. It demands a fair amount. You can see I've been using my father's copy where he's written notes all through it. He's often gone back and reread things and thought about them. And it's really intended to be that kind of book. But if you and your students can understand it, internalize it, and begin to apply it, you'll find that you can solve problems that you didn't even know how to define before. And now you can not only define them, but you can outline creative solutions. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy the book.